So here we are going to study the simple deposit multiplier. In order to understand the simple deposit multiplier, we need to know how the deposits are created in the banking system. The whole process is called the deposit expansion process. So we are going to use the numerical example to illustrate this. First, suppose the Federal Reserve purchased the $100,000 Treasury bill from the Bank of America. From what we learned previously, we know this is the part of the monetary policy. Taken by the Federal Reserve. So basically the Federal Reserve inject $100,000 cash or money into the banking system. But here comes the question, how much deposit can be created in the banking system? So let's first look at the T account of the Bank of America after this transaction. And we know if the Fed purchased $100,000 securities from the Bank of America, the security held by the Bank of America will decline by $100,000, which will be shown on the asset side. At the same time, when the Fed purchased $100,000 securities, they will put money into the reserve account of the Bank of America. So the reserve held by the Bank of America will increase by $100,000. So now Bank of America have additional $100,000. So what is the Bank of America going to do with this additional $100,000? They don't want this $100,000 just sit in their reserve account. They want to lend out as a loan because they can earn interest. So suppose Bank of America now lend this loan to the low-seed bakery. So what happened to the Bank of America, the T account? Let's look at here. And from previous slide, we know after monetary policy, security held by Bank of America declined by 100,000, but the reserve increased by 100,000. To lend out the 100,000 loan to the low seed, the loan will increase on the asset side. Remember, loan is asset of the bank, so loan will increase by $100,000. But how can the Bank of America give this $100,000 to the low seed bakery? They simply put this $100,000 into the checkable deposit of the low seed bakery. So that's what happened on the liability side. So you can, on the other way, you can think about like this. The Bank of America, when they lend out a loan, they basically give the credit to the someone who want to borrow the money. So they give the credit by deposit money into the checkable deposit. So this T account still keep the balance. So after Rosie, the bakery found out their checkable deposit increased by $100,000 because of the loan, they are going to spend it. So here we assume the low seed will use this $100,000 loan to buy some equipment from the Bob Bakery equipment. So in order to buy the equipment, low seed will write a check against her account in the Bank of America and pay this $100,000 check to the Bob Bakery. Once the low seed write this check, pay the equipment, what happened to the Bank of America account? The checkable deposit will decline by $100,000 because the bakery equipment is going to deposit a check in the one bank, and because the deposit declined by 100,000, the reserve will reduce by the same amount. That's what we learned previously. Anything happen to the checkable deposit, reserve will change by the same amount. So both the reserve and the checkable deposit declined by $100,000 to 0. And the following what we talked about previously, after Bob get $100,000 check, he's going to deposit this check into his bank. And suppose PNC Bank is Bob's the bank's. So in this case, after his deposit, the checkable deposit will increase by $100,000, and PNC Bank reserve increase by the same amount. So here comes the question: is the PNC Bank going to keep this entire $100,000 reserve in the Federal Reserve account, or keep this reserve as a cash in their wallet? No. As a banker, if you have an additional reserve, you want to lend out the reserve. But here comes the question: if you want to lend out this $100,000 reserve, how much can you lend out? Can you lend out the entire $100,000? The answer is no, because we can see here, we can continue. For the PNC Bank, this $100,000 reserve come from the deposit. It's not from the open market operations. So according to the Federal Reserve rule, they need to keep at least 10% as a reserve. So 10% of the $100,000 is $10,000. So PNC Bank will put $10,000 into their reserve account and lend out the rest of the $90,000 as a loan. And this story will continue. Someone get this $90,000 loan will buy stuff, buy goods, buy equipment. And the seller of the goods and the equipment receive this $90,000, and then they will deposit into their bank account. Suppose their bank account is a SunTrust Bank. So they put $90,000 into the bank, which means the SunTrust Bank, the reserve increased by $90,000. Again, the SunTrust Bank can keep 10% of the $90,000 as a reserve and lend out the rest of the $81,000 as loans. So that's what happened here. SunTrust Bank. Yeah, so similarly, $90,000, because it's a 10% of the deposit. $9,000 here is 10% of the 90,000 deposit. The rest of the reserve will be lent out as a loan, and someone will get this loan, buy stuff, and pay the check, and this story will continue, go on, and without ending. So that's what we call the deposit creation process, or deposit expansion process. But let's move on to the next slide. Next slide actually summarizes what happened to the whole banking system. And we know the PNC Bank received $100,000 deposit from Bob the bakery. And then story move on to the SunTrust Bank. Then this story can continue to the third bank and the fourth bank, and each time you can see the deposit will be created. First 100,000, then 90, then 81, and these numbers will continue to increase. And I mean this process will continue to increase. And each number here, like $90,000, is 90% of the previous bank. The 81,000 is 90% of the previous bank deposit. And if we add up all these numbers together, we actually can get 100,000. We actually can get $1 million here. So similarly, we can add all the loans created in the bank, and we can find out the total amount of the loan increase in the banking system is $900,000. Similarly, we add the reserve created in each bank together, and then we find out for the whole banking system. The reserve is created by $100,000. And do you remember this story started from what? This story from the Fed buy $100 security in the open market. And eventually it actually create $1 million deposit in the banking system. It create 100,000 reserve in the banking system. So change of the deposit here for the whole banking system is $1 million. Change of the reserve here is $100,000 in the whole banking system. So what's the relation between these two? And obviously you can see change in the deposit here, 1 million, is equal 10 times change in the reserve, $100,000. So this 10 is important number here. This 10 is what we call the simple deposit multiplier. Yeah, you can see the top of this slide. Remember, this 10 is called a simple deposit multiplier. But where does this 10 come from? If you pay attention, this 10 actually is the inverse of the required reserve ratio, because the required reserve ratio in this case is a 10%. So 1 over 10% is a 10. So next time if you want to calculate the simple deposit multiplier, you don't need to show the whole the T account we showed previously. You can simply calculate the simple deposit multiplier equal 1 over required reserve ratio. So that's the formula you need to keep in mind. The second formula you need to keep in mind is change in the deposit in the simple deposit creation process equal the simple deposit multiplier. That's inverse of the required reserve ratio multiplied by change in the reserve in the whole banking system. So that's the second equation we can learn from this whole story here. Keep in mind, the Fed initially only inject $100,000 into the money, into the banking system, but eventually, with this story, it can create $1 million the deposit. It can create $900,000 loans. So you can see that's a multiplier effect here. So Fed just inject a smaller amount of the money, it actually can create the larger amount of the deposit and the loans in the banking system.